All right, last class we went over observational learning and we made the connection to the first half of the semester. We talked about how information processing theory influenced the mediational process of Bandura. We talked about Bandura's connection to conditioning. We're going to elaborate a little bit more on conditioning today and how reinforcement's used because it is a fairly popular theory or method of learning. We went in depth in Bandura's mediational process, and this is what your video was about last time. How do these four elements fit in to learning the fire churn? And we also talked about its connection, observational learning's connection to experiential learning. But now we're going to get into reinforcement. We're going to talk a little bit about punishment, but we're not going to talk about its use. We're just really going to try to focus in on reinforcement because it has long-lasting implications for learning, especially behavioral learning. And it is directly connected to conditioning, more specifically classical conditioning and operant conditioning. And it's used quite a bit in operant conditioning. But I love this little matrices, this chart, because it really helps you understand what's the difference between reinforcement versus punishment. Before you can focus on reinforcement, we have to get away from the two main terms most people get confused, which is reinforcement versus punishment. So the easiest way to decide, are you using reinforcement or are you using punishment or is it being used against you, is look at behavior. What do you want to happen with behavior? Do you want to increase or maintain behavior? You're using reinforcement. If you're trying to decrease an undesirable behavior, then it's punishment. So there's a couple of key terms there. Is it a desired behavior? Then obviously you would want to increase it or maintain it. That's reinforcement. Is it an undesired behavior? Obviously you'd want to stop that. You'd want to decrease it somehow, so that's going to be punishment. So are you increasing a behavior? That automatically, or maintaining it, automatically tells you it's reinforcement. Because you don't want to do that to an undesirable behavior, right? You don't want to increase or maintain an undesired behavior. It has to be a desired behavior. So the terms I look for when somebody's trying to determine if they're using reinforcement or punishment or if it's being used against them or for them is what's happening with behavior? What's the end goal? Are you trying to increase or maintain behavior? Reinforcement. Is it a desired behavior? Obviously, you'd want to increase or maintain that, so therefore it's reinforcement. If we're talking about an undesirable behavior, you're dealing with punishment because obviously you'd want to decrease it. So that's my first go-to. Before I even look at, is it positive or negative? So now let's look at the difference between positive and negative reinforcement and punishment if we want to go in depth. I don't want to spend too much time on punishment because really this whole day is more about reinforcement and its connection to conditioning and how it was used in conditioning and then how we're going to use it for the activity for the day. So positive reinforcement is we are adding something desirable, you're adding something to get somebody to increase or maintain their behavior. So if I add something pleasant that you want to increase your behavior, that's positive reinforcement. If I take something adverse away that you don't want to get you to increase or maintain a behavior, that is negative reinforcement. So let's talk about those two. Actually, let's get punishment out of the way real quick, and I'll give you the two examples for positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement so we don't confuse punishment and reinforcement. Positive punishment, think of corporal punishment. If somebody did something I did not want them to do, like break a window, and I went out and imposed corporal punishment, I'm adding something they don't want to get them to stop doing whatever it is that they are doing, whatever behavior they're exhibiting. If I take something away that they want, so somebody, say my child gets bad grades and I don't want them to get bad grades, that's an undesirable behavior, and I take their video games away from them, that's negative punishment. Okay, now let me give you a popular example of positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement used on the same experiment and explain why it's negative reinforcement. Because most people, when you hear this example, will think, oh, that sounds like punishment. All right, we've got two main types of conditioning, which we're about to talk about. Actually, let's scroll down here and we'll look at this next slide because it shows it. And so we have classical conditioning, which was Pavlov's dog, where they figured out that the dog was picking up on when that bell rang, it was about to be fed. So you could ring the bell alone and the dog would start to salivate. So it was associating that bell with being fed. And that was eliciting an involuntary response. The dog wasn't thinking about salivating, it just naturally happened. It was instinctive. That is classical conditioning in a nutshell. It's involuntary behavior. The person's not aware. Now, operant conditioning, you're trying to lead somebody into voluntary behavior. Sometimes it starts off with involuntary behavior, and the person or animal picks up on what it is they should do that you want, or that they should do to either get rewarded or to get something adverse taken away. So Skinner developed this box. B.F. Skinner used operant conditioning so that the rat would eventually voluntarily exhibit the behavior he wanted. And he put this rat in the box. On one side was a lever. And when I say a lever, it's not a lever that you pull. It was a lever that was pressed. And if that rat pressed that lever, it would get fed something it wanted. That would be positive reinforcement. And it had to do it within a certain time period. So this is a timed interval. If the rat did not press the lever within a certain period of time, it would receive a shock, something it did not want. And that was negative reinforcement. You would think it's punishment, but here's why it's reinforcement. And here's how it's connected to involuntary behaviors becoming voluntary. The rat would start to hop around. So, all right, the rat doesn't press the lever within a certain period of time. Let's say it's 2 minutes. Electrical shock goes off. Rat starts hopping around. It does not know why the shock is going off, but it accidentally bumps up against the lever. That's the reason the lever needed to be pressed instead of pulled. Then the shock stops. 2 minutes goes by again. The rat still doesn't know it needs to press that lever. Shock goes off again. It starts hopping around, bumps up against that lever. Eventually, it cues in that, hey, if I press this lever in a certain period of time, that shock doesn't start. Or if it starts, I can get it to stop. Eventually, it does it soon enough in that time interval that the shock never happens. And if it presses it in that time interval, it gets positive reinforcement because not only does the shock never happen, so that it doesn't have to be removed, the negative adverse thing doesn't have to be removed to exhibit the desired behavior, that's your key word. It also gets fed something it wants, something positive that it likes. That's also going to lead to exhibiting the behavior the researcher wants, having the rat press the lever. So initially, it accidentally pressed the lever. It didn't know anything about turning that shock off, but it cued in and eventually voluntarily started pressing the lever so the shock would never happen. And also because it would get fed as long as it did it in the time interval. So the reason the shock is negative reinforcement is because it's being taken away when the rat exhibits the desired behavior. The reason it's positive reinforcement when it gets fed, that's something the rat wants. And those two working hand in hand, both types of reinforcement are really powerful in changing behaviors. So we went from involuntary to voluntary. And that will happen much faster in an animal that can think outside the box and has a higher level of intelligence. Sometimes you can start directly with voluntary behavior and make it clear what you want the subject to do. So that's operant conditioning, and how positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement were used together to exhibit the desired behavior in the rat. All right, now feedback is extremely important. Now let's just talk about more verbal feedback for now. There are different forms of feedback. It can be any stimulus coming in to indicate that that's the desired behavior you would want if you were using it in reinforcement. Like the food being given is a form of feedback, right? That's what we want you to do, therefore we're feeding you. The shock being removed is a form of feedback that the rat cued in on. But let's talk in terms of verbal, because I think that's something we can all relate, and it'll be something easy we can attach to the activity for today. That's what we're going to talk about in terms of reinforcement. All right, positive feedback. That would be great job, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's constructive. It's fairly vague. Doesn't really tell the person what they did correct or what you liked. It's just great job. Negative feedback. Again, it can create anxiety and stress. That's going to lead us into Yerkes Dotson model when we start talking about motivation and arousal states and performance. But for this, it's no different than positive feedback, in that positive feedback may make somebody feel good, but you still didn't tell them what they did correct. Negative feedback may create a level of anxiety and stress and can result in conflict and somebody just kind of tuning out because it's not constructive. You still haven't told them what they did incorrect and what they need to correct. And then you have corrective feedback. It specifically outlines, all right, either this is what you did correct or this is what you did incorrectly. And it can be done with positive feedback or negative feedback. Typically, I like to use positive constructive feedback using like the sandwich method. Hey, overall, good job. Here's some stuff that you may want to change. Here's some stuff that you did correct. Keep doing that. Change these other things. Overall, great job. You're on the path for improvement. That would be the sandwich method. You're giving them definitive things that need to be changed. So I really like the sandwich method. And then you got motivational feedback. So it reinforces strengths and it identifies improvement. I just gave you an example of motivational constructive feedback in the sandwich method. So I told them what they were doing correctly. I identified what they need to improve. It's one of the most powerful forms of feedback. That's what I want you to focus on today for today's activity. We're doing something that we're only adding one component that you haven't seen. We're using the fire churn, but we're turning it into a whip drill. What I want to know from you as you make the video, what type of feedback would be most important to do this activity if you were the one performing it, or you can take another approach if you had to teach this to somebody. You already know how the fire churn works, how to put it together. Now we're turning it into a whip drill. This time, instead of just talking about reinforcement, what type of feedback would be most important to get the most to reinforce those behaviors we like, that we want to improve upon? How could you use that, and what type of feedback would be most important? That's what we're talking about for today's activity.